Hi. So the purpose of this video or these videos is to explain a kind of workbook or perhaps a series of three workbooks that I've developed with my friend and collaborator Thomas Hohler around openings and guiding prepositions, guiding principles really for the cultivation of creative practice. Through these two courses, I've gradually refined a kind of general theory of sound, musicking, and finally the latest installment, instruments, comprising book 1, 2, 3 in this project that we're calling Tuning In, a new theory of sound, music, and instruments, grounding prepositions for the cultivation of creative pedagogy and practice. So what this book is sketching really is or what this book kind of it's informed by the idea that music pedagogy always grows from within specific musical communities of practice. It's always cultivated by creative musicians exploring their craft, exploring their musicianship in specific communities, historic communities. So given that, there can be no real strong distinction between the practice and an inquiry around creative musicianship and the actual practice of musical pedagogy, teaching and learning music. We can't really have a strong distinction between those two different processes. So given that, these three books present a series of prepositions, guiding heuristics that can be used by both musicians and music educators to cultivate and bring attention to different aspects of their artistic and pedagogical practices. So in this sense, what we're presenting is something between a music workbook, a teaching resource, a kind of scholarly investigation into sound, music, and instruments, as well as a kind of just general recipe book for exploring new musical and sound-informed research methodologies. But it's also not reducible to any of these forms. It's kind of like a contrapuntal, hybridized form we're presenting, where prepositions are followed by invitations for practice, which are followed by different concepts and a concepts and ideas section that explores scholarly connections to all of this. So our hope with this is that educators, creative musicians of different stripes, genres, and instruments can use this book to design and imagine for themselves their own creative music practice programs and curricula. So in this sense, we're trying to be non-didactic, just work from some basic first principles. We're adopting this idea of prepositions rather than prepositions. So we're talking in a sense about something that comes before proposing, comes before our positioning, before contextual applications. In a way, a preposition is a kind of a priori proposition, a kind of ground from which we can move before we take position. So these are kinds of, these can be thought of as kinds of pre-practice invitations. And in that sense, we're not really manipulating or forcing attention along a particular course or curriculum, but rather trying to just create openings and considerations from which individual educators, individual artists can give shape to their own practice. So with that, I'll just kind of outline how the three books relate to each other, which is basically that we start with this idea of sound theory based on the first preposition of book 1, which is that you are a sounding being experiencing sounding events within a broader sounding environment. And falling from this basic recognition, this whole book 1, sound theory, is dedicated to thinking about what are those fundamental aspects of sound from which we can know a little bit more about how different sounding beings attune or tune into their different sounding environments. So that's the ground. That's the ground of book one, and this leads us to book two, where we talk about musicking theory, which is how this process of tuning into a sounding environment, at least when we're talking about social animals like cetaceans and birds and some primates at least, manifests through the creation of what some people call a proto-musical taskscape. So you tune into the soundscape, and pooling together different capacities, developing different capacities of tuning into this soundscape. Doing this with others creates a social proto-musical taskscape. We're talking about how these animals' different sonic capacities become closely attuned, associated with patterns of social behavior and broader social actions. It's a kind of shared sociality. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a musicking taskscape. And we can almost think about music pedagogy itself across any kind of formal, informal division as a process of tuning into and cultivating together with others shared musical taskscapes. So musicking theory is about how the various ways in which animals, and again, not only humans, those three groups of animals that I mentioned in particular, how do these animals use musical forms and musicking behavior and musicking cognitive capacities to explore and really attune to each other, most principally as a form of social entrainment. That's what musicking is offering these very cultural animals. That leads us finally to book three, which builds from these principles of tuning into a soundscape through a musical taskscape to think about what musical instruments are as a kind of technology, as a kind of cultural technology or techne that offer these social animals, these players of these instruments, certain musical affordances of action, of response. And again, it's recognizing, along with the recognitions of book two, that these affordances always grow out of cognitive, social, cultural functions. The ways in the specific context in which these instruments are created are central to, and the specific cognitive and evolutionary heritage of the people who create these instruments is essential to the story. So instrument theory takes us to the subtleties of what does it mean to be a sounding being, extending your resonance through the sounding environment, through the musicking taskscape, through technology like instruments. Another complexity in the story. So that is our three books. In a way, you can think of these three books as driven by two fundamental concepts: the concept of musicking itself, rather than the specialist or limited designation of music as a product or a thing in itself. We're talking about musicking, dancing, listening. All these essential aspects of everyday life are part of musicking in the broadest sense. And the other essential concept we have is soundscape itself. Tuning into that idea that we are immersed in a shared sounding environment and everything that implies for us as social resonating beings. So, yes, again, this video is just a way to kind of introduce the basis of this project and give a little bit of an outline to these three books. Thanks so much.